The numbers are staggering. Over 1 million Russian casualties, thousands of tanks reduced to scrap metal, an economy teetering on the edge of collapse, international isolation unlike anything seen since the Cold War. And yet, Vladimir Putin refuses to stop. While the rest of the world watches in disbelief, the Russian president continues to pour resources, money, and human lives into a war that, by any rational calculation, should have ended long ago. Peace negotiations, he walks away. Ceasefire proposals, rejected diplomatic off-ramps, ignored. But here's the thing. Putin's behavior isn't irrational. In fact, when you understand the forces at play, both inside Russia and on the global stage, his refusal to negotiate starts to make a twisted kind of sense. Today, we're going deep into the mind of Vladimir Putin and the machinery of the Russian state to understand why peace remains impossibly out of reach. What we'll discover is darker and more complex than simple stubbornness or pride. This is the story of a leader trapped by his own choices, a nation spiraling into an abyss, and a conflict that may not end until one side completely collapses. Let's begin. To understand why Putin won't pursue peace, we first need to understand how autocratic regimes actually function, because they operate on completely different logic than democracies. The dictator's dilemma. In a democracy, leaders can admit mistakes. They can change course. They can lose elections and peacefully transfer power. But in an autocracy, especially one built on the cult of personality like Putin's Russia, showing weakness isn't just politically damaging. It can be fatal. Putin has spent over 2 decades crafting an image of himself as the strong man who restored Russia's greatness after the chaos of the 1990s. He's the leader who stands up to the West, who doesn't back down, who always wins. This image isn't just propaganda, it's the foundation of his entire regime. Admitting that the invasion of Ukraine was a catastrophic mistake would shatter that image overnight. And in a system where power flows from perceived strength, that would be the beginning of the end, the Stalin playbook. But there's something even more sinister at work here. Putin isn't just worried about looking weak, he's worried about staying alive. History has taught Putin a harsh lesson. Autocrats who show weakness don't retire peacefully. They get overthrown, imprisoned, or killed. Just look at what happened to Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, or Nicolae Ceausescu in Romania, or countless other dictators who lost their grip on power. Putin knows this history intimately. He's studied it, and he's determined not to become another cautionary tale. So he's adopted what we might call the Stalin strategy. When things go wrong, double down. Purge the doubters. Silence the critics. Project confidence, even as the walls are closing in. Since the invasion began, we've seen this play out in real time. Officers who fail are removed, or worse. Oligarchs who question the war fall from windows or die in mysterious accidents. Opposition politicians are imprisoned or poisoned. The information bubble. This creates a vicious cycle. The more Putin punishes those who bring bad news, the less accurate information he receives. His advisors learn to tell him what he wants to hear, rather than what he needs to know. Intelligence reports get sanitized. Military briefings get exaggerated. Economic data gets manipulated. Putin ends up making decisions based on a distorted version of reality. A version where Russia is winning, where victory is just around the corner, where one more push will break Ukraine's resistance. Western intelligence officials have reported that Putin genuinely seems to believe his own propaganda. He's surrounded himself with yes-men who feed him a steady diet of misinformation, and he's purged anyone who might contradict the narrative. This isn't just speculation. Intercepted communications between Russian military commanders reveal a pattern of systematic lying up the chain of command. Casualty figures are understated, territorial gains are overstated, equipment losses are hidden. One leaked conversation from 2024 captured a Russian colonel telling his subordinates, "I don't care what the real numbers are, just give me something I can put in the report that won't get us all fired." When your entire information ecosystem is built on lies, how can you make rational decisions about war and peace? Now let's talk about the elephant in the room. The sheer magnitude of resources Russia has poured into this conflict. The economic black hole. Russia's defense spending has reached levels not seen since the Soviet era. We're talking about roughly 40% of the entire federal budget now going toward military and security spending. That's not just weapons and ammunition. That's salaries for millions of soldiers, pensions for veterans, subsidies for defense contractors, propaganda to keep the population supportive. The Russian economy has essentially been restructured around the war factories that once produced consumer goods now produce artillery shells. Scientists who once worked on civilian projects now develop drones and missiles. Entire cities whose economies were based on mining or manufacturing now depend on military contracts. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Russia can't afford to keep fighting, but it also can't afford to stop the military-industrial monster. Let me explain what I mean. Right now, Russia's military-industrial complex employs millions of people either directly or indirectly. These jobs pay relatively well compared to other sectors of the Russian economy. They're keeping entire regions from economic collapse. If Putin agreed to peace tomorrow, what happens to all those workers? What happens to all those factories? What happens to the defense contractors who've gotten rich from government contracts? You'd see mass unemployment in regions that are already struggling. You'd see a sharp contraction in GDP. You'd see social unrest on a scale that could threaten the regime. It's a classic sunk cost fallacy, but on a national scale, Russia has invested so much in the war that stopping now would mean admitting that all those resources, all those lives, were wasted. And politically, that's impossible for Putin to accept the demographics disaster. But there's an even darker dimension to this. Russia is facing a demographic crisis that predates the war, but has been dramatically accelerated by it. The country's population has been shrinking for decades due to low birth rates and high mortality rates. The working-age population is declining, and now, hundreds of thousands of young men, the very people Russia needs to reverse this demographic decline, have been killed, wounded, or fled the country to avoid conscription. This isn't just a problem for the next few years. This is a problem that will haunt Russia for generations. The children who will never be born because their potential fathers are dead on a Ukrainian battlefield. The economic productivity lost because an entire generation has been decimated. Any rational leader would recognize this and try to stop the bleeding. But Putin isn't thinking rationally about Russia's long-term future. He's thinking about his own short-term survival, the mobilization gamble. Here's where it gets really complicated. Putin has mobilized hundreds of thousands of men from Russia's poorest regions, places like Dagestan, Buryatia, and Tuva. These are areas with high unemployment, little opportunity, and populations that are largely non-Russian minorities. For these families, military service has actually been an economic lifeline. The signing bonuses alone can be worth several years of average wages in these regions. The death benefits for fallen soldiers are similarly substantial. This creates a perverse incentive structure. Some families in these regions are actually financially dependent on the war continuing. If it ends, that income disappears. Putin knows this. He's essentially bought the loyalty, or at least the silence, of Russia's most economically vulnerable populations by turning them into cannon fodder with good pay. But this strategy has a limit. Eventually, even the poorest regions will run out of men willing to fight. Eventually, the economic costs will outweigh the benefits. Eventually, the whole house of cards will collapse. The question is, will that happen before Ukraine collapses? And Putin seems to be betting that it won't. To really understand Putin's thinking, we need to go beyond economics and politics. We need to talk about ideology and history, specifically Putin's vision of Russia's place in the world, the Lost Empire syndrome. Vladimir Putin has never hidden his nostalgia for the Soviet Union. He's famously called its collapse the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Not World War II, not the Holocaust, the end of the Soviet Union. This tells you everything you need to know about his worldview. Putin sees the current Russian Federation not as a modern nation-state, but as a diminished empire that must be restored to its former glory. And in his mind, Ukraine isn't a separate country. It's a breakaway province that needs to be brought back under Moscow's control. This isn't just rhetoric. Putin genuinely believes in a concept called the Russian world. The idea that all Russian-speaking peoples and territories should be unified under Russian leadership. Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, the Baltic states. In Putin's vision, these are all rightfully part of Russia's sphere of influence. The NATO obsession. Putin has consistently framed the invasion as a defensive action against NATO expansion. And while most Western analysts dismiss this as propaganda, it's important to understand that Putin actually believes it. From his perspective, NATO's eastward expansion since the 1990s represents an existential threat to Russia. Every country that joins NATO is one more country that has escaped from Russian influence. One more country where Russian power doesn't reach Ukraine. Potentially joining NATO would be, in Putin's mind, the final straw. It would mean NATO troops and missiles on Russia's border, just a few hundred miles from Moscow. It would mean losing Russia's traditional buffer zone against Western attack. Never mind that NATO is a defensive alliance with no intention of invading Russia. Never mind that Russia's aggressive actions are precisely what's driving countries to seek NATO membership. In Putin's paranoid worldview, the West is engaged in a coordinated campaign to weaken and destroy Russia, and Ukraine is the battleground where that campaign must be stopped. The historical mythology. Putin has also wrapped this war in layers of historical mythology that make compromise nearly impossible. He's invoked the memory of the Great Patriotic War, World War II, comparing the fight against Ukraine to the Soviet Union's fight against Nazi Germany. He's called Ukrainians Nazis and framed the invasion as a moral crusade to denazify the country. This is absurd historical revisionism. Of course, Ukraine's president, Vladimir Zelensky, is Jewish and lost relatives in the Holocaust. But facts don't matter when you're building a mythology. By framing the war in these terms, Putin has made it existential. If this is truly a fight against Nazis, then compromise is impossible. You don't negotiate with Nazis, you destroy them completely. Anything less would be a betrayal of the Soviet veterans who defeated Hitler. This mythological framework has painted Putin into a corner. How can he negotiate peace with an enemy he spent years calling Nazi scum that must be eliminated? The heir to the Tsars. There's another layer to Putin's imperial ambitions. He's increasingly embraced the legacy of the Russian Empire, not just the Soviet Union, but the Romanov dynasty that ruled Russia for 3 centuries. Putin has rehabilitated historical figures like Ivan the Terrible and has surrounded himself with Orthodox Church imagery. He's positioning himself not just as a post-Soviet leader, but as the heir to 1,000 years of Russian imperial history. In this narrative, Ukraine, or Little Russia, as it was called in the Tsarist era, is an inseparable part of the Russian Empire. To allow it to break away permanently would be to betray centuries of Russian history. This isn't just about territory or security. It's about Putin's place in history. He wants to be remembered alongside Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, leaders who expanded Russia's borders and increased its power. Negotiating a peace deal that recognizes Ukraine's independence and territorial integrity would make him the leader who presided over the loss of Russian territory. That's not the legacy he wants. Putin's decisions aren't made in isolation. Russia operates within a complex web of international relationships, and some of those relationships are actually incentivizing the war to continue the China factor. Let's start with the obvious: China. As Western sanctions have isolated Russia economically, Moscow has become increasingly dependent on Beijing. China has become Russia's largest trading partner, buying Russian oil and gas at discounted prices and selling Russia the technology and components it needs to keep its military-industrial complex running. But this relationship isn't between equals. With every month that the war continues, Russia becomes more and more of a junior partner, essentially a resource extraction colony for Chinese industry. And here's the thing: this arrangement works perfectly for China. Beijing gets cheap energy and raw materials. It gets to study Western weapon systems by examining the wreckage of NATO equipment in Ukraine. It gets to test Russian military performance in real-world conditions. And most importantly, it keeps the United States and NATO focused on Europe rather than the Indo-Pacific. As long as Russia is bogged down in Ukraine, that's one less major power that could oppose Chinese ambitions in Taiwan or the South China Sea. It's also soaking up Western military aid that might otherwise go to countries like Japan, South Korea, or the Philippines. Does China actually want the war to end? Publicly, Beijing calls for peace. But privately, Chinese leaders probably see value in the conflict continuing at a low simmer, not escalating to nuclear war, but not ending either. And Putin knows that if he agreed to a Western-brokered peace deal, he'd lose Chinese support. Beijing would see him as unreliable, as someone who bends to Western pressure that would leave Russia even more isolated than it is now. The North Korea connection, then there's North Korea. In a development that would have seemed impossible just a few years ago, Russia and North Korea have formed a tight military alliance. North Korea is supplying Russia with millions of artillery shells and ballistic missiles. In return, Russia is providing North Korea with food, fuel, and, most ominously, military technology that could improve its nuclear and missile programs. This is a marriage of convenience between two isolated states, and it creates another incentive for the war to continue. If Russia made peace, would North Korea continue to supply weapons? Would the partnership continue? From Pyongyang's perspective, a strong Russia tied down in conflict with the West is extremely valuable. It diverts attention from North Korea's own nuclear program and gives Kim Jong-un a powerful ally in his standoff with the United States and South Korea. The Iran dimension, Iran, too, has become a key Russian partner. Iranian drones have caused massive destruction in Ukraine, and in return, Russia has shared intelligence and military technology with Tehran like China and North Korea. Iran benefits from Russia's confrontation with the West. It weakens the coalition of countries trying to contain Iran's regional ambitions. It creates opportunities for Iran to expand its influence while America is distracted. The axis of the sanctioned. What we're seeing emerge is something unprecedented in the post-Cold War era. An alliance of sanctioned, isolated states, Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, that are finding strength in each other and creating an alternative pole of power to the Western-led international order. For this alliance to work, Russia needs to remain in conflict with the West. The moment Russia makes peace and attempts to normalize relations with Europe and America, this new axis starts to fracture. China, North Korea, and Iran all lose their most important European partner. Putin understands this dynamic. He knows that his geopolitical relevance in the 21st century depends on positioning Russia as the leader of this anti-Western coalition. Peace with Ukraine would undermine that position. So we've explored the psychology, economics, ideology, and geopolitics that keep Putin locked into this war. But what does this actually mean for the future? How does this end? Scenario 1. The slow collapse. The most likely scenario, according to most analysts, is what we might call the slow collapse. Russia doesn't suffer a sudden, dramatic defeat. Instead, it gradually exhausts itself, economically, militarily, and socially. Sanctions continue to bite. The economy continues to deteriorate. More and more soldiers die. Infrastructure crumbles. Quality of life declines. And eventually, the system reaches a breaking point. This could take years. Russia has proven surprisingly resilient, and its population has shown a remarkable tolerance for suffering. But there are limits to what any society can endure. In this scenario, Putin either dies in office or is removed by a palace coup, led by elites who recognize that continuing the war will destroy Russia. A new leadership negotiates a face-saving exit that allows Russia to claim some kind of victory while effectively abandoning its maximalist goals. Scenario 2. The frozen conflict. Another possibility is that the war simply never ends, at least not officially. Like the conflicts in Korea, Cyprus, or Moldova's Transnistria region, the Russia-Ukraine war could freeze into a permanent stalemate with an active but low-intensity frontline. Russia occupies parts of Ukraine indefinitely. Ukraine refuses to recognize the occupation but lacks the military power to expel Russian forces completely. The international community gradually accepts the status quo, sanctions are partially lifted, and the world moves on to other crises. This scenario is deeply unsatisfying but depressingly plausible. It allows Putin to avoid the humiliation of total defeat while also sparing Russia from complete economic collapse. Ukraine remains divided and damaged, but at least the mass casualties stop. Scenario 3. The escalation spiral. The darkest scenario is that things get worse before they get better. Putin, facing battlefield losses and domestic pressure, decides to escalate, perhaps using tactical nuclear weapons, perhaps launching a massive missile campaign to destroy Ukraine's civilian infrastructure. Perhaps expanding the war into neighboring countries. This would be catastrophic, but it's not impossible. When autocrats feel cornered, they sometimes choose to gamble everything on one desperate move, and Putin has shown repeatedly that he's willing to cross red lines that rational actors wouldn't approach. NATO would then face an impossible choice: respond militarily and risk World War III, or let Russian aggression succeed and watch the entire post-1945 international order collapse. Scenario 4. The internal rupture. There's one more scenario worth considering: that Russia itself fractures. The country is far more fragile than it appears. Ethnic tensions simmer in many regions. Economic inequality is extreme. The social contract between the government and the people is breaking down. If the war goes badly enough, if casualties mount high enough, if the economy collapses far enough, Russia could face serious internal unrest. Not just protests, but actual threats to the territorial integrity of the Russian Federation. Regions like Chechnya, Dagestan, or even Siberia might see opportunities for greater autonomy or independence. Ethnic minorities who've borne a disproportionate share of the war's casualties might refuse to keep fighting. Oligarchs might decide that Putin is a liability and move to remove him. This would be chaotic and dangerous, a nuclear-armed empire undergoing internal collapse. But it's happened before. The Soviet Union fell apart in less than 2 years. Once the process began, what needs to happen? So how does this actually end? What would it take for Putin to pursue peace? The hard truth is that Putin probably won't pursue peace on his own. The incentives are all wrong. The pressures all push toward continuing the conflict. The information he receives is too distorted. The ideological commitments are too deep. For this war to end, one of several things needs to happen. First, Russia could suffer such catastrophic military defeats that continuing becomes literally impossible. Not just difficult, but impossible. The army collapses, the weapons run out, the economy completely breaks. Second, Putin could die or be removed from power, allowing a new leadership to change course without the baggage of personal failure. Third, one of Russia's key supporters, most likely China, could decide that the war has become too costly or risky and pressure Moscow to negotiate. Without Chinese economic support, Russia's position becomes untenable. Fourth, Ukraine could somehow convince Russia that achieving its goals through military force is impossible, while simultaneously offering an off-ramp that allows Moscow to save face. This would require extraordinary diplomatic skill and probably major concessions that Ukraine is unwilling to make. None of these scenarios are imminent, which means the war will likely continue for months or even years to come. The human cost. Let's not lose sight of what this means in human terms. Every day this war continues, people die. Soldiers on both sides, civilians in Ukrainian cities, children who lose parents, families torn apart, communities destroyed. Economic analysis and geopolitical strategy are important, but they shouldn't make us numb to the real suffering. Behind every statistic is a human being, someone's son or daughter, mother or father, friend or neighbor. The tragedy of Putin's calculus is that he's willing to accept all of this suffering. Russian suffering, Ukrainian suffering, rather than admit a mistake. That's what makes autocracy so dangerous. It removes the normal human empathy and accountability that might otherwise prevent such catastrophes. So there you have it. 4 interconnected reasons why Vladimir Putin refuses to end the war in Ukraine. The trap of autocracy, where showing weakness means death. The sunk cost fallacy on a national scale, where Russia has invested too much to stop. The Imperial Delusion, where Putin's historical mythology makes compromise impossible, and the geopolitical chess game, where Russia's new allies actually benefit from the conflict continuing. None of these factors are going away anytime soon, which means, unfortunately, that this war is likely to grind on, consuming lives and resources until something fundamental changes. What can the rest of the world do? The West can continue to support Ukraine militarily and economically. It can maintain sanctions on Russia to increase the costs of the war. It can work to isolate Russia diplomatically and economically. But ultimately, this is Russia's choice to make. And as long as Vladimir Putin is in charge, that choice seems clear. The war will continue until it can't, until Russia is exhausted, until Putin is gone, until the entire rotten structure he's built finally collapses under its own weight. It's a dark conclusion, but it's the honest one. Sometimes there are no good options. Sometimes all you can do is endure and resist and hope that eventually justice prevails. If you want to understand more about the geopolitical forces reshaping our world, check out our video on China's military buildup in the South China Sea, or our analysis of how Western sanctions are actually affecting the Russian economy. Thanks for watching. And remember, staying informed is the first step toward building a better world.